This story begins in a Russian prison, where an American prisoner named Frank was locked up. Frank was actually a big-time thief who had committed a $100 million fraud using fake checks. An FBI agent named Carl had arrived to take him back to America. While Carl was talking to Frank, Frank suddenly started feeling unwell. At first, Carl thought this might be Frank's trick. But when his condition got worse, Carl immediately sent him to the hospital. Seizing the opportunity, Frank escaped. But unfortunately, the police caught him again. Frank's whole story flashed before him from the beginning. Frank was born into a very happy family, and his parents loved each other deeply. One day, Frank's father took him to a shop to buy a suit, but the shopkeeper said the store wouldn't open for a while. Come back at 9. Hearing this, Frank's father quickly pulled out a necklace and asked the lady if it belonged to her. The lady was impressed and agreed to give them the suit. After getting the suit, Frank went with his father to a bank, where the bank manager came to meet them. Frank's father had suffered a huge business loss and needed a loan from the bank, but the bank manager refused because a tax fraud case was running against him. Frank's father explained that a staff member had delayed filing taxes, causing the accusation, but no bank was willing to help them. A few weeks later, the government seized all their cars, properties, and even their home. They were forced to move into a small house. Despite all this, Frank's father opened a bank account with 25 already in it. Due to financial hardship, Frank had to change schools, from private to public school. At the new school, a chubby boy started bullying Frank and mocked him, saying, "You look just like a teacher in that suit." Hearing this, Frank got furious and actually walked into the boys' class as a teacher. He shouted at everyone to sit down and started teaching the entire class. He called the bully to the front and embarrassed him in front of everyone. This teacher act continued for several days. But one day the school principal found out and called Frank's parents to school. His father scolded him in front of the principal, but outside the office he laughed proudly at what Frank had done. One day when Frank came home from school, he saw another man in his mother's bedroom. His mother tried to act normal, but Frank had already understood everything. A lawyer came to their house and revealed that his parents had decided to divorce. The lawyer asked Frank who he wanted to live with, his mom or his dad. Seeing his family fall apart, Frank was completely broken. He ran away from home because he couldn't bear to watch his family separate. He reached a new city and decided to stay in a hotel. Since Frank had no money, he took out his checkbook and started giving checks to hotels. But after a few days, when the checks bounced, the hotels threw him out. One day the idea struck him. Why not make fake checks and cash them at banks? Back then, banks didn't have much technology, so it was actually possible. Frank made some fake checks, wrote fake names on them, and cashed them at different banks around the city. If a cashier refused, he confidently used his dad's necklace trick. But after a few days, his scam was discovered, and his checks stopped working at all banks. One day, Frank saw a pilot outside a hotel, accompanied by 3 or 4 beautiful air hostesses. He noticed everyone was treating the pilot with great respect. Frank thought, if I become a pilot, my checks will be cashed easily. He went to the airport pretending to be a reporter and told an officer he was writing an article about pilots. During the interview, Frank cleverly found out where pilots get their uniforms. He then called that tailor company and requested a new uniform. After some clever maneuvering, he got a uniform made. But at payment time, the shop owner said, "You don't need to pay. Just give me your pilot ID and we'll bill your airline." Luckily, Frank had already made a fake ID, so he got the uniform for free. He then went to a bank to cash his checks. The uniform worked wonders. Even the bank manager, who used to ignore him, came out personally and cashed his check. A few days later, he checked into a hotel and learned he could also cash large amount checks, but they had to be salary checks. Frank made a fake salary check and took the logo from a toy plane and put it on his check. He went to a bank to cash it. The check was cashed, and he also discovered he could cash salary checks at airports too. Frank loved this because he wouldn't have to keep visiting banks anymore. One day at an airport, the receptionist asked him if he was a dead pilot. Frank didn't know what dead meant, so he said yes enthusiastically. On the plane, he learned dead means an extra pilot on board. Since Frank wasn't a real pilot, he was very scared sitting in the cockpit. After a while, he came out and started chatting with an air hostess. He used the necklace trick on her too, and impressed her. After the plane landed, the two spent the night together at a hotel. Frank was quite mature for his age, so nobody suspected he was a fake pilot. He was living life to the fullest. A few days later, he impressed a bank cashier too, and gradually learned the entire banking ecosystem. He discovered that banks use a special typewriter to encode checks. So Frank bought a second-hand typewriter at an auction. By now, Frank wasn't just a con man, he was a professional con man who treated his work like a business. Days passed and Frank started cashing bigger and bigger amounts with these checks. The FBI soon caught wind of his fraud. They appointed an officer named Carl to the case and ordered him to find the fraudster as soon as possible. Carl was a very sharp officer and took his work very seriously. A few days later, Frank met his father, to whom he had been writing letters for months. His father believed Frank had truly become a pilot and was very proud of him. Frank gifted his father a brand new car, but his father refused to keep it, saying the government was still after him because of the tax fraud case, and if he brought the car home, they would seize it too. Frank also tried to give his father money, but he refused that too. Meanwhile, Carl and his team were monitoring Frank's every move because his frauds were growing by the day. During investigation, Carl's team arrived at a hotel where Frank had last used a check. After questioning, they found out Frank was still staying there. Frank had been at that hotel for several days, so everyone around knew him. Carl immediately went to Frank's room with his gun, but instead of panicking, Frank told Carl his name was Barry Allen, and he worked for the Secret Service, and his team had already caught the check fraudster. When Carl asked for his ID, Frank confidently handed over his wallet, but before Carl could check it, Frank pointed out the window and said, "Look, our officer just arrested the fraudster." It was actually Frank's neighbor, helping a blind man into a car. From a distance, Carl thought it was real and believed Frank's story. Frank gathered his belongings and told Carl, "Seal this room, I'll take these things downstairs." After Frank left, Carl opened the wallet. It was empty. He realized Frank had fooled him and walked right out in front of his eyes. Carl was deeply embarrassed. When he reached his office, his boss scolded him badly. Meanwhile, the airline company also found out that a fake pilot had been traveling for free on their planes. When the media got the story, they named Frank James Bond. Frank loved his new identity. He bought a James Bond-style car and started dressing just like James Bond. Days passed, and on Christmas, Frank called Carl at his office. Frank apologized for the other day and gave his address, saying he wanted to meet. But Carl said he wouldn't fall for his tricks again. He also taunted Frank, "No matter how much money you have, you're completely alone inside. You called me on Christmas because you have no one else to talk to." These words stung Frank and he hung up. But this time, Frank had given his real address. The next morning at a cafe, Carl realized that Frank had said his name was Barry Island, which is actually a cartoon character name. Carl told his team that the fraudster is just a kid who looks older than he is. He asked them to pull a list of runaway children. After thorough investigation, the FBI team arrived at Frank's home and met his mother. They confirmed from a photo that Frank was her son, who had run away from home some time ago. Carl told her that her son had become the biggest fraudster in the country. If she heard anything about him, she should inform the police immediately. Meanwhile, Frank was throwing a party at his new home. But during the party, a friend got hurt, and Frank took him to the hospital. There he met a nurse named Brenda, who was crying loudly because a doctor had scolded her. Frank impressed Brenda with his sweet words and asked if he could get a job at the hospital. Frank had realized that pretending to be a pilot was too risky, so he decided to become a doctor. He went home and made a fake Harvard degree. Then he watched a bunch of medical movies and went for an interview the next day. He impressed the doctor with his words, and when the doctor saw Frank's Harvard degree, without a second thought, he gave Frank a senior doctor position. Whenever Frank was on duty, He'd gather all the doctors and give them nonsense advice. And in his free time, he romanced Brenda. One day, Frank was suddenly called for an emergency case, where a small child was badly injured. Seeing so much blood, Frank nearly fainted. But he kept his composure and asked a junior doctor, "What would you do if you were in my place?" Whatever the doctor answered, Frank agreed and said, "I trust you completely to handle this case," and quietly slipped away. Meanwhile, Carl visited Frank's father and told him everything about Frank. The father said, "I don't know where he is. But even if I did, I wouldn't tell you." Carl noticed letters Frank had sent his father. He noted the return addresses on the letters and immediately informed his team. A few days later, Frank declared his love to Brenda and proposed to her. Brenda agreed, and Frank went to meet her parents. During the conversation, Frank falsely told Brenda's father that before becoming a doctor, he had also been a lawyer. Just like him, Brenda's father was very impressed. After dinner, he asked Frank why such a successful man would want to marry his daughter. Frank replied, "I'm just a simple man who loves your daughter." Brenda's father was so delighted. He seemed ready to hand over all his property to Frank that very day. Frank then asked, "If I wanted to practice law in your state, what would I need to do?" Brenda's father said Frank would just need to pass a state exam. After that, he could practice law there. For the next several days, Frank studied hard and passed the exam, becoming a licensed lawyer. A few days later at Brenda's house, seeing her happy family, he missed his own. So the next day he went to visit his father, where he learned his mother had remarried. Heartbroken, Frank left without saying a word. He had hoped that one day, by earning a lot of money, he could reunite his family. Christmas came again, and Frank called Carl once more. He told Carl, "I'm getting married soon. I want us to forget this feud and go our separate ways." Carl replied, "After all your frauds, that's impossible. As long as I have this job, I will not stop chasing you." Carl also realized Frank would use his real name for the wedding. So Carl called all the printing presses in town, hoping if Frank had printed wedding invitations, he could track him through his future wife. On the day of Frank and Brenda's wedding, Carl and his entire team arrived to arrest Frank. Seeing Carl, Frank took Brenda into a room and confessed everything, that he was no doctor or lawyer but a fraud. Frank said, "Even though I hid my identity from you, I truly love you." Frank started to leave and told Brenda to meet him at the airport in 2 days so they could flee the country and start a new life together. 2 days later, Frank reached the airport and waited in his car for Brenda. Brenda arrived at the airport, but she had several police officers with her. Frank realized escaping the country wouldn't be easy, so he came up with a plan. He dressed as a pilot and started visiting colleges around the city. He said his airline company urgently needed air hostesses. After several interviews, he selected some beautiful girls and dressed them in air hostess uniforms. Then took them to the airport. All the police officers at the airport got distracted by the girls, and Frank slipped right past them. Meanwhile, a man who looked just like Frank stood outside the airport in a car. When the police spotted him, they chased him thinking he was Frank. But it turned out Frank had paid him to wear a pilot uniform and distract the police. And just like that, Frank fooled the entire FBI and walked right past them. Frank then traveled to various countries and kept cashing large amount checks. The FBI eventually stopped chasing him since he was operating outside the country. But Carl refused to drop the case. He wanted to catch Frank no matter what. During investigation, Carl found out Frank was currently in Russia. But finding him in a country as vast as Russia without an exact location was nearly impossible. Then Carl came across a check Frank had recently made and realized Frank was now printing his checks. Carl also recalled that Frank's mother was from a small village in Russia that had a printing press. Christmas came around again. When Carl arrived at that small Russian village, he found Frank printing the checks. Seeing Carl, Frank welcomed him like an old friend. Carl told him that the Russian police were waiting outside the printing press. If Frank tried to run, they would shoot him. But if he surrendered, Carl would take him safely back to America. Carl would try to get him the lightest sentence possible. Frank accepted Carl's words and surrendered. The Russian police arrested him and locked him in a high-security prison. The story then returns to the present. Carl was taking Frank back to America, and their plane was about to land in a few minutes. Frank said he wanted to talk to his father. Carl told him his father was no longer in this world. Hearing this, Frank completely broke down and went to the plane toilet and cried loudly. A while later, the plane landed, but Frank was still in the bathroom. After calling out several times with no response, Carl broke the door down, but Frank had already unscrewed the sink bolts and made his way to the lower section of the plane. As soon as the plane stopped, he escaped. He went to see his mother and found she had started a new family, even with a little daughter now. Shortly after Carl arrived too, he knew Frank would go to his mother's place. The FBI arrested him and presented him before a court. Since Frank was only 19 years old, the government gave him just 12 years in prison. A few months later, Carl came to visit Frank because a new fraud had appeared in the market. When Carl showed Frank the check, Frank immediately understood what was wrong with it. Carl realized that only Frank could help them stop such frauds. The next time Carl visited Frank, he brought an FBI officer with him who was also impressed by the way Frank solved the case. A few months later, Carl got Frank bailed out and gave him a job as an FBI agent. Frank's job was to stop check frauds happening across the country. He would face 50 years in prison. Frank tried his best to work sincerely, but very soon got bored of his job. He pulled out his own file from the FBI database and deleted all his records. Then he grabbed a pilot uniform and tried to flee the country on the weekend. But Carl stopped him and said, "Life has given you a second chance to change. You're still young, and your whole life is ahead of you. You don't need to run anymore. But if you still want to go, I won't stop you." The next day at the office, Carl waited anxiously for Frank. When Frank hadn't shown up by 10 a.m., Carl feared he had run away again. But this time Frank didn't run. He arrived at the office and started working on different cases. A few years later, Frank married a wonderful woman and started his own finance company to prevent all kinds of bank fraud. At the end of this movie, we see that Frank's story is based on real events, and ultimately, through his hard work, Frank became a billionaire.